Hello and welcome to my Classroom Impact Project report for the unit EDLL604. So this is the agenda for the presentation today. I will be including the slides for this presentation in the appendix of the transcript. So we'll get straight into it. So in terms of the project itself, it was held at Helier College, which is a senior secondary school on the northwest coast of Tasmania. The class that was in focus was a Psychology 3 class, which was mixed years 11 and 12. Time frame for this was term 3, 2024. So 10 weeks, the first 8 weeks being focused on an independent project on the topic of memory, and the last 2 weeks being the end of a personality unit. The curriculum focus areas for the psychology course itself are psychological knowledge, reasoning, analysis, communication, and inquiry. Here's the MySchool data for Helier College. I just wanted to bring attention to the ICSIA value being 937, which is the second lowest of Tasmanian colleges. So in terms of the actual project itself, the learning issues identified was a lack of critical thinking seen in the Psychology 3 students. Justification for this came from some social notes and there's some comments students were saying, questions they were asking, some early assessments, comparisons with the prior cohorts ratings as well. Some impacts of potentially addressing this learning issue is improvements in ATARs in the short term, connection to the curriculum focus, critical literacy in line with the Lifting Literacy Initiative throughout Tasmania, and addressing inequity in executive functioning with Hackman and Lee cited there, looking at how low SES impacts executive functioning and then as such, critical thinking. So we have some baseline data here. So you can see that cohort 2024 is underperforming when compared to cohort 2023. Those grades are based on the standards identified on the right-hand side from task. So things like the C ratings being the identify, B rating being describe, A rating being explaining, going from assessing, analyzing, evaluating in a similar way. And then tying that into how Monash University defines critical thinking on the left-hand side, we can see things like identifying, analyzing, evaluating there too. So expanding upon that, when I'm sort of talking about critical thinking, what I've broken it down into is critical thinking skills, which align with Bloom's taxonomy. So remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, creating. We can see how that connects up to the task standards as well from the previous slides. And critical thinking dispositions, which have been identified by Lee et al. 2022. So things like discipline, cognition, motivation, attentiveness, open-mindedness, clarification skills, organizational skills, and reflection. These all support critical thinking and the critical thinking skills on the other side. They go hand in hand. In terms of the goals for this project, I wanted to decrease the Z ratings, basically making sure that I have evidence of achievement against every single criteria. So to 1% in this goal, but ideally to 0. The percentage of T ratings also reducing to 10% or lower, perhaps. T ratings being evidence has been provided of achievement, but not enough to a passing standard. Goal number 3 was student ratings of their own critical thinking dispositions will improve by a statistically significant amount, defined as P less than 0.05. And the evidence of analysis and evaluation will be present in student work samples collected through term 3. I'll explain how we're going to achieve those in a moment. So the focus question that was selected was, will student critical thinking dispositions and skills be improved through the integration of scaffolded questioning, inquiry-based learning, and reading and writing conferences? To break that down a bit, the aim from that is to improve both critical thinking skills and dispositions with the 3 pedagogical foci of scaffolded questioning, inquiry-based learning, and reading and writing conferences. So each of those foci have been identified as a manner in which we can improve critical thinking. So scaffolded questioning, typically following from lower to higher order thinking, by framing questions to allow students to progress through those levels. We can use the rigor elephants framework, which moves from acquiring knowledge to actually adapting knowledge. So touching upon discipline cognition, but also critical thinking skills identified earlier. And it also ties into the design of student experiments related to their independent projects. Inquiry-based learning was the other pedagogical focus. So I wanted this project to be as non-invasive as possible. So as students were completing an externally assessed folio on the topic of memory, thought this was a great pedagogy to implement as it's aligned with what they're already doing. It also aligns with critical thinking dispositions of Lee et al. So students have to be motivated, they have to be attentive, they have to have discipline cognition, and they also have to be reflective against their process. Finally, reading writing conferences were also chosen, which are individual small group meetings with the teacher to deconstruct text, so such as prior research to include in a report, or improving student written work, so through, in particular for this project, written comments on student drafts, but also verbal conversations too. In terms of how this was tested, it was tested under paradigm of pragmatism. This is always going to be outside variables in a school-based setting, and a mixed methods approach was taken for the collection and analysis of data. So going back to this diagram, you may have noticed that I didn't talk about the bottom section, which is what I'm going to do now. So to actually go through the critical thinking skills, we're going to be looking at student grades, as we saw those tie into the actual Bloom's taxonomy verbs, and those ratings connect to those. Student work samples as well, looking for analysis and evaluation. Student questioning data, so responses and questions posed. Conference transcripts as well. For critical thinking dispositions, we're looking at pre and post survey of the critical thinking dispositions and some observational notes. So we have some quantitative data there in terms of the student grades and the critical thinking dispositions survey, but mostly qualitative in terms of the work samples and questioning data, which will have content analysis applied to it, and the conference transcripts and observational notes will have some thematic analysis conducted. In terms of how it was tested, continuing with that, our participants were 22 students across both years 11 and 12, mostly year 12s, 3 students with disability, 2 First Nations students. For the ethics of this, again, it has a strong research basis, so the risk of harm is low, noting the high stakes assessment, as I stated earlier. No deception present, all students were aware of what was occurring, they were informed, they consented, no students actually withdrew from this project, and the data has been de-identified in the pedagogical foci, having chosen to align with student learning plans as well, so that, again, attempted to be a non-invasive project in terms of a pre-tertiary class. So the following data has been collated, and we may as well get straight into it. So this is the student grade data, pre and post. So we can see the internal marks at the end of term 2, so the 9th of August on the left-hand side, and the internal marks at the end of the year, so at the 14th of October. So the percentages along the bottom there, otherwise the frequencies of each rating per criterion is placed there. Of note is criterion 4, 6, and 8, as they are the independent project criterion. So we can see some really strong improvements in that area, particularly in criterion 4 and criterion 6. There's some really strong improvements there. So even looking at, say, the A ratings going from 1 to 8, criterion 6 going from 1 to 8 as well. Criteria 1 and 7 were also impacted, as those are the personality essay based criterion, which was looked at right at the end of term 3. So we see some improvement there, not as strong perhaps as the others. Criteria 2, 3, and 5 were less impacted by this project. However, we do still see improvement over time in criterion 5 in particular. And we've highlighted the differences in the percentage of ratings there. So A ratings, we had an increase of 17.61%. B ratings, we have a decrease of 1%, 1.14%, still sitting around about that almost 40% mark. C ratings, similar, sitting around a 30% mark, bit of a decrease there, perhaps sort of pushing up a bit higher. The T ratings, pleased to note that they've decreased by 11.93%, so going from 14%, 14.2% to 2.27%, which you'll note actually achieves our second goal of decreasing them to 10% by the end of total ratings by the end of term 3. So we've exceeded that goal. And we also have the Z ratings dropping by 0.57%. In this case, dropping to 0%, which is great to see. Achieves goal 1, but also it means that every student in this class has shown achievement against every single criterion. And in relation to the T ratings, most of them have achieved passing standard, with only 4 Ts awarded, sorry, at the end of this project. terms of the critical thinking disposition survey, from the pre and post data, we don't really see too much here. As we can see, the p-value on the top left-hand corner, it's 0.336, which is above 0.5, so it's not statistically significant. So no real conclusions can be drawn from this data. To assist analyzing this, a number was applied to the Likert scale data from this survey. So strong disagree received 1, disagree received 2, as there were different numbers of students in the pre and the post survey results. So this sort of helped translate that into proportions as opposed to modes to compare. So looking at the group descriptors down the left-hand side, most of it appears to be just noise or variation between time points. The two that I'd like to draw your attention to are the clarification skills going up. So if we look at the descriptors on the right-hand side, if we look at clarification skills sitting around about a 3, which is more in the neutral territory, up to a 4, which is more in that sort of agree territory, whereas reflection has decreased. So from more of a sort of agree, strong agree point to a more firm agree, whereas the others are similar enough that we can't really say too much about that. Perhaps with our clarification skills, completing an inquiry project, and meeting with the teacher more frequently, improve their own ratings of seeking out clarification, and reflection. Unsure why that has decreased. This data does not actually meet goal 3, which is disappointing to report, but we can talk about that a bit later with our implications and limitations. In terms of the student work sample content, I've just sort of pulled out a few different samples. Each of the work samples is 9 to 10 pages long. So I've just sort of pulled out a couple of common aspects that popped up in each work sample to talk about. First one, and really we're looking for that analyzing and evaluating content, particularly in the final drafts for these examples in line with goal 4. So if we look at the first example there, we can see that that person who was looking at state-dependent forgetting, they've gone through and they've identified memory as a 3-step process, coding, storage, retrieval, describing each of those steps. Whilst that is relevant, it's not necessarily tied into their topic. So we can see over time they've actually analyzed their own work and evaluated to actually identify what is relevant and what do I need to include, particularly in a really tight word count for their project. So in their final draft, they actually outline the forgetting, well, they describe the forgetting concept and they explain encoding, storage, and retrieval in the context of that forgetting concept, highlighting the use of the term access of information, as that's quite important to the forgetting topic. And they're proceeding to actually explain their forgetting theory, which is relevant to their project. The next example, this comes from their methodology, so student B. Initially, they failed to identify correctly their research design. So you can see later they've said it's an independent, but early on they actually were thinking it was repeated measures, which is strictly speaking incorrect. But we can also see their growth in terms of actually identifying the levels to their IV and also stipulating that it's the number of words correctly recalled with the dependent variable. Those slight changes in languages and that extra detail shows that analysis and consideration of their reader and what sort of questions their reader may be asking. So if, for example, I'm the reader looking at their independent variable in that first one, I might ask, well, what colors are you actually using? So this student has actually considered that and they've included that to support ease of communication. Next, we see student C actually had no design section initially. So we see a similar sort of, well, a bit of a more intense growth in the second and third draft. In a similar manner, they identify the IV and its levels and also the dependent variable. But we see initially they actually were not able to even identify what design they were using in the independent variable. So this shows quite a bit of growth in that space. Student D, it almost appears as though they've taken a step back between their first and second draft, but you'll note that they've actually taken away one of the levels of their independent variable. This is because they were actually involved in the school's theatre production. So they're outside of class for 2 to 3 weeks. So they actually recognized that they didn't have as much time to complete their project. And as such, they were able to, evaluate their own process and decide upon only using 2 levels of their IV and actually stipulate how they were going to present their data with a higher percentage of line recall and also a lower error rate too. With these last two, the student E originally had no ethics section, but eventually ended up with extensive detail on each of the 8 ethical considerations. So there was also evidence of ethical practice in the appendix. So they had their consent forms for the parents and students and also the informational text they'd sent out, which shows a really strong creation component. They actually made those ethics consent forms, but also they evaluated their own writing and in terms of making it easy for the marker to see that they had considered the ethics and that they had actually enacted what they had said in their report itself. So they'd made that really clear. And student F, I bring this in an example because quite a few students struggled to identify studies that they should include in their introductions. So initially the student spoke about HM, which is a case study relating to the separation of short-term memory and long-term memory. However, they were looking at chunking methods, so it's not really as related. So they hadn't correctly identified a study that related to their experiment. However, by their final draft, they were talking about Miller, which relates to the capacity of short-term memory, but also Huffman, which specifically talks about chunking words to take advantage of that capacity of short-term memory. So we can see some analysis there, a bit of an evaluation of which studies should go into their introduction and which studies perhaps should not. We also see some themes in the conference transcripts. I won't sort of go through each one. I'll just highlight a couple. So early implementation, so this is the first few weeks. A lot of identification issues in terms of what students were actually doing, a bit of helplessness in terms of where they were beginning. The middle of implementation, they had some difficulties in managing their data, managing timelines, also allocating information, but also enacting their own research methodology. So bringing what they've written down into practice, so applying what they were trying to do. And late implementation, a lot of them were requesting just marks for their actual current projects so that they could then go back and improve their marks that they had just been given as a guideline. And also enacting an assessment report. So they're able to evaluate their own writing against some of the feedback they'd received from both me, but also from the external task markers too in previous years. Student questioning content, this sort of centers on some of those lower critical thinking skills. So we can see during the foci implementation, quite a few questions that students felt confident answering were the remembering understanding type questions. So simply recalling information, not too much thought to it. So 3 structures of the psyche or what are the 5 needs. It's very low level thinking. And questions beyond this point, there's a lot of wait time or students really struggle to answer these with correct terminology or even answer them at all. Whereas post-foci implementation, we can see a lot more of that applying, analyzing, evaluating question. And students were a lot more confident in responding to these, and there was less wait time. Students were able to correctly use the terminology to do with the personality unit in answering these. So, for example, how does Michelle criticize trait theories? So comparing theories and evaluating them, and actually applying the Big Five model as to like where someone might sit on each of those. Finally, we have the themes for our observational notes. Again, I'll just touch upon a few things from here. Early implementation, low inclusion of prior research. Clarity of the hypothesis is quite low. Late implementation, there's a lot more requests for draft reviews, high focus, present in the students, greater detail is starting to be provided, and then post-implementation, the concepts are related directly to the hypothesis. The clarity is improved. We also see some translatable skills there in terms of once they move back into their essay writing, their introductions align with the body of the text and also the conclusions. The actual density of information in the text was improved too. So in terms of the actual results and the implications, our key findings in relation to our critical thinking skills, we see a progression in student conferences and work samples from lower to higher order thinking. So as sort of touched upon, moving from particularly that remembering understanding level much more into that applying, analyzing, and really quite into that evaluation level. Skills were transferred from essay writing as noted from the grade data. So we saw improvements in criteria 1 and 7. So not only did we see improvements in folio-based criterion, but also essay-based criterion. High-level responses to questions involving greater critical thought. So the questions that involved much more analysis, evaluation, and application. There was less wait time and greater level responses. In terms of our critical thinking dispositions, there was no statistical significance found between pre and post implementation. We did see a slight increase in clarification skills, a slight decrease in reflection skills. Discipline cognition improved as seen observationally, so particularly in terms of applying theory, discussing theory, and explaining concepts and terms. And the organization of text improved as seen from observational notes as well, tying a little bit into that organization skills, but also into discipline cognition. Limitations of this study, there's a few. So all student work has been marked by the researcher, introducing bias and a level of subjectivity. So particularly even in my own analysis, as the person who's been marking and teaching the entire time for these students, there is quite a bit of subjectivity there. Student absence during critical thinking disposition surveys, as noted earlier. High stakes assessment is present, so therefore students are probably more motivated to improve their work. There was also a whole school focus on metacognition, so there's some outside influences. I'm not the student's only teacher, they usually have 3 or 4 others. And so with each teacher focusing on metacognition, perhaps there's been some influence there. Small sample size too. Perhaps also an abnormal sample, as most of these students are generally on a university pathway. So I'd be curious to see how this approach interacts with a class of students who perhaps are on a TAFE or a full-time employment pathway after school. 4 students, so 18% of the sample size, were absent for a college theatre performance during the project implementation. So that was about 2 to 3 weeks, which is quite a significant chunk of time. And also a differing number of conferences and work samples for each student. So some students were requesting more conferences, some students requesting less. Some students had sent in 5 or 6 work samples for feedback and review, whereas others had only sent the minimum of 3. So the impact of the reading writing conferences perhaps is a bit different between each student. So the major ideas that I'd like to pull out from the data that we've seen relating to literacy, reading and writing conferences were particularly beneficial for examining writing for conciseness, locating relevant information. There's also links to the evaluation of their own writing. So they're able to go through and say, well, what actually is important in what I've written and how do I bring that into the word count? Because particularly quite a few went over. So pulling themselves back a little bit. Scaffolded questioning supported discipline cognition. So actually, particularly looking at that personality unit, they were able to increase their use of terms and that understanding and application of some of those concepts. Increased interaction with the teacher promoted further clarification of ideas and concepts. So in relation to the memory content, sitting down, discussing with me, and deconstructing some of those articles that students were using as their background information, that actually clarified a few of those ideas, both in their writing, but also in conversation with the students too. And the inquiry project facilitated deep thought on a memory topic of interest, leading to some increased critical thinking skill. So particularly when we look at creating a scientific report, they've got to analyze the data, they've got to report upon the data, discuss it similar to how I'm doing today, and actually connect that to prior research too. So a lot of evaluation creation type thought happening there. So in terms of the actual focus question, returning to that, overall, I would say that these pedagogical foci have improved critical thinking dispositions and skills, have probably a greater impact on critical thinking skills rather than dispositions, particularly if we think about the evidence that we have for that. More evidence for the critical thinking skill improvement than perhaps the dispositions, bar some of those observational notes for a couple of different dispositions there. And in terms of some of the implications to broader teaching and learning, So a point I wanted to highlight was the importance of numeracy to critical thinking. A lot of students really struggle with creating graphs and analyzing their data. So I just wanted to highlight that this project being quite literacy focused, bringing in some numeracy into that too. A focus on the process of a product is beneficial for student critical thought and literacy capability. So drafting, reviewing, those reading writing conferences was really focusing on the actual process of writing a report rather than solely creating a report and then submitting that. So that was really beneficial for their critical thinking. Reasonable challenge. These students chose a topic of a challenge suitable to them. And whilst an inquiry project is quite large, they've all done very well and they've stepped into their zone of proximal development. And there is some strong evidence of learning there. Engaging students in the feedback process facilitates learner improvement as the qualities of learning are made visible. And a little bit outside of this project perhaps, but the self-observation of the teaching process has promoted reflective practice. I found myself going through, particularly some of those earlier videos, noting some common themes in what students were asking and issues they were having. By actually going back over that and sharing those insights with the class, I noted that a lot more students felt a lot more confident, and I found my own teaching improved through watching myself and the interactions I was having with students of how I could make my meanings clearer and how I could perhaps make some of those conferences shorter to make the best use of time. So these are just my references for the slides that you would have seen. But thank you for your time. I have gone a little bit over, but thank you.